In this video, we're going to shift gears to the next part of the marketing mix and focus on promotion. And this is where things like advertising fall in, and so there's quite a bit to cover. We'll do a pretty thorough look at a number of elements, but of course in this short video, we won't be able to dig into every single component. But let's get started. The first thing to point out is that advertising is big business. If we look at just the top 50 biggest advertisers in terms of spending in the United States, this is a fairly recent statistic, you see things like Comcast spending nearly $6 billion a year, AT&T $3.5 billion, Procter & Gamble $4.5 billion. These are annual expenditures. When you roll this all up, advertising is big business. There's a lot of money that goes out to try to get customers to buy your product. But how do we actually approach this, right? Advertising is not like Mad Men, where you have a brilliant advertising person who comes up with a solution and all of a sudden everybody buys their product. That's just not how it works. It's actually a lot more systematic than that. And a framework that would allow us to consider all aspects of advertising looks something like this. It starts with the question of who do we target? In other words, who should we actually talk to? We then move on to what our objective is. What's the motivation of the advertising campaign? Under that, we have to determine what the actual message is, what the actual advertising looks like, what media to promote this on, television, radio, social media, and so on. Once we do that, we decide on our actual budget and the money that we want to spend. And finally, and critically, we determine what metrics we use to evaluate our campaign's success. Sometimes these last items, the ones in blue, are described as the 5 M's of advertising and promotion. So let's dig into each one of them one at a time. When we consider who to target, it seems straightforward. We go after customers, but that's not always true. Sometimes what we're trying to do is influence customers to buy a product. That's fine. But sometimes we're promoting to channel partners like distributors or to social influencers in hopes of getting them to promote the product on our behalf. This implies two overarching strategies, what we call a push promotional strategy versus a pull promotional strategy. In a push promotional strategy, what we're doing is actually trying to convince the next layer down in our distribution chain to buy our product. So we advertise, for example, as a manufacturer to the wholesaler with the hope that the wholesaler then chooses to buy our product. Then the wholesaler advertises, for example, to a retailer who then purchases from the wholesaler, and then the retailer is the one ultimately promoting to the customer who then actually purchases the end product. This is very different from what we call a pull strategy, where a manufacturer directly promotes to a consumer with the hope that the consumer then demands the product from the retailer, who then demands it from the wholesaler, and then ultimately buys and demands it from the manufacturer. And so thinking about what we're trying to achieve in terms of who we're targeting is critical before we even begin the task of deciding how we enact that promotional strategy. Once we determine who our target is, we need to start thinking about what our objectives are. And again, it seems straightforward. We just want to sell more product, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. One model that is typically used to understand how people engage in a consumer purchase behavior is called the AIDA model, or the attention, interest, desire, and action model. The idea is that there are steps that consumers go through when deciding what to purchase, and each step is necessary for an entire purchase experience to take place. At the bottom of this hierarchy, you have attention. People merely need to be aware that a product exists. Then we need to generate interest in that product, which then leads to an actual willingness and desire to purchase, which ultimately culminates in an action, which is a transaction. And depending on what you're trying to accomplish, different promotional activities can impact each of these components in a different way. So for example, if we look at a promotional mix, all the different ways that we could conduct promotional activities like advertising, public relations, sales, promotions, personal selling, and social media, each one of those benefits a different portion of this AIDA model in a different way. Advertising and public relations tend to be very effective at gaining attention and interest, but they don't do a whole lot to move people in terms of action. On the other hand, sales promotions, they're not going to get a lot of people to know about a product that doesn't really work well on attention, but they're phenomenally good at leading to action due to a discounted price. And so depending on what you're trying to do, whether it be bring awareness about a product or convince people to actually transact, different strategies might be more or less appropriate. So once we've decided on our objective, what we really need to focus on is the message itself. And to be fair, this is probably the most fun and interesting part of promotional activity because this is where you get to come up with the creative pieces. And so let's take a look at how that's actually done. A standard messaging strategy has 3 components to it. At first, we develop a position and a personality for our ad campaign. Then we decide on what our big idea or our creative concept is that's going to be the hook that's going to get people excited about our promotional activity. And then finally, we determine the specific types of appeals that we use to convince people to actually take action. So a pretty classic successful promotional campaign was conducted by MasterCard. MasterCard was seen as a pretty boring and stale brand, and so they wanted to reinvent themselves. And they came up with this idea of priceless. So if you've ever seen those ads, they look something like this, or like this. And what they were trying to do is create a personality for MasterCard that wasn't boring and stale, but was rather exciting, and led people to think that their credit card, their MasterCard branded credit card, was actually something fun and exciting, as opposed to boring and stale. So the big idea that they had was to change credit cards from being this mundane thing to being about life experiences. That's the essence of what they were trying to convey. What's important is when we think about this big idea, it's not just one ad. It's actually an entire ad campaign. So just one example, not MasterCard related, is for Adidas. So what I'm going to show you is a series of ads that all emphasize the same basic idea. So have a look. What this is doing is it's trying to take the same basic big idea, which is that Adidas are for everything, right? Not just for high athletics, it's for everyday experiences, and that everybody can be a runner, and everybody can be the type of person that buys an athletic shoe. And what you're seeing through this repetition, through these varied ads that all have the same messaging, is a cohesive story that Adidas can tell. Other ways that big ideas can really take hold, not just through repetition, is through something like vivid imagery. So for example, this advertisement for toothpaste is kind of stark, right? I mean, imagine having barbed wire going through your gums. That's terrible, and it catches your attention enough to convey the idea that this particular toothpaste is for sensitive gums. Or consider this non-smoking campaign. It's very, very vivid. A cemetery full of graves, and the one area that doesn't have any is the non-smoking area. It's really pushing an image and an idea in a big and powerful way. Another way to convey ideas is through surprise. Often surprise comes with humor as well, and I want to show you one example of a commercial that does this particularly well. Have a watch.
Hair with high shine and gloss, full body and bounce, perfect, healthy condition, is only because of our conditioning shampoo. Beautiful hair like this can never be yours. Sleeky shampoo, only for the dogs.
And then lastly, once you have your big idea encapsulated, you need to think about the types of appeals that might generate interest among consumers. And we definitely don't have enough time to go into all of those because there's a myriad of ways that consumers can be convinced that your product is worth buying. Just to put up a few of them on the screen here, we see that you have things like sex appeals, fear appeals, testimonials. All of these can lead people to engage with your advertising behavior so that it ultimately converts in attention, interest, desire, and purchase. Next, we might want to ask, where do we actually put our advertising and our promotional activities? In the traditional sense, we've got things like television and magazines, radio, newspapers, and so on and so forth, and each of them has their pros and cons. What's critical is that there's always a trade-off between reach and cost. The more reach, the more people that are going to be exposed to your promotion, the more expensive that's going to be. And so we'll come back to this when we talk about budgeting and thinking about how much we need to actually increase exposure to generate the desired effect. So hold that thought for a moment. But there's also a whole host of non-traditional advertising locations, what we tend to call guerrilla advertising. For example, here's a great wanted poster, which is actually an ad for Grand Theft Auto 4 when it was released. So these were plastered around cities. They get your attention because it's striking, but they're actually an ad, not truly a wanted poster. Here's another wonderful pull-away tab poster that was hung around that says, "Missing 2 hours, last seen while waiting for Clarendon to start working. If found, please call 1-800-4-ZYRTEC." What a clever way to get people's attention without actually being in their face in conventional places like television or radio. Think about unique locations to advertise. Here's a Papa John's ad. It looks like you're looking through your peephole in your apartment door. But in fact, what they did is when they would deliver a pizza to a particular apartment building, they put these cardboard cutouts in front of the peepholes so it looks like you're getting a delivery. Again, what a clever way to actually engage consumers. Many years ago, I was actually in Germany, and the train stations there were filled with bikes because a lot of people would commute on bicycle. So what Lufthansa did, a German airline, is they put these seat covers over all the bicycles that were lined up there to protect them from getting wet. And it's a brilliant way to advertise. They're providing a useful benefit to consumers while promoting their product. Product prompts are a great example of non-traditional or guerrilla advertising. Here's one from 3M. They took $1 million in cash and sandwiched it between their non-breakable security glass. And this was meant to promote how effective this glass was. Now, dirty little secret, off camera there is actually a security guard who's protecting that glass, but the message sticks. And for the sake of time, I'll just go through some other ones quickly so you can see some more really creative examples. So here's Axe body spray. Here's a promotion for super glue. For a local music school. Energy saving initiatives. FedEx. Mr. Clean. A job posting board. A hair detangler. A yellow highlighter. Anti-smoking campaign. Environmental conservation campaign. All of these are creative ways to get at people's attention. And the reason we need these is because we are often inundated with advertisements in more conventional settings. So anything that can break through that clutter can be very, very effective. So once you've decided where to advertise, it's important to consider how much to spend. There's a classic finding known as the advertising response function, which looks something like this. The idea is that there are two things going on at once. There's a threshold effect and a saturation effect, which basically says the following. Towards the beginning of your advertising expenditure, the effect of advertising on sales is relatively small. When you hit that threshold, the response of sales to advertising is quite high. But at some point, you hit a saturation effect where the advertising isn't doing much anymore. And so when budgeting, it's very important to think about how you can achieve that optimal amount of advertising that puts you in the sweet spot where that line is very steeply increasing. Now, that is a complicated task and topic for another time, but this is where you want to be thinking about when you think about budgeting. You don't want to budget too little, but you also don't want to budget too much. And lastly, we need to be thinking about metrics of evaluation. It's so important for us to know if the money we're spending is actually generating positive ROI and positive outcomes in the dimensions that we had identified earlier. And there's two real components here. We can have efficacy in terms of communication and outreach, that's awareness, and efficacy in terms of sales. And if your firm is not tracking both of these, it's unclear if the dollars you're spending on advertising and promotions are actually doing anything. So that's a pretty quick summary of promotional strategies. This is a huge topic, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on this every year, and so we're not going to get to every detail in just a few minutes. But what I hope this does is it refreshes your mind on how important promotional activity is in the context of marketing. Next video will conclude with a discussion of distribution strategies, or the last P, which is place.